Hello, everyone. I'm Cecily. I am the program coordinator for Busboys and Poets Books. If anyone joining us live, thank you so much for joining. If you're seeing this later on, thank you for tuning in. Today, we are having a fantastic read aloud of Adria Theodore's book, A History of Me. We are being joined by Adria herself and Leah Henderson, author of Daddy Speaks Love. Hello.
Hello.
That one. Hi. It's so great to have you guys here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
We're big fans of your books at Busboys, and we're very excited to bring it to the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to let Adria start, and then we'll all hop back on here for a discussion.
Great. Hello. I think you're going to have the PDF, yes, of the book, A History of Me, illustrated by Aaron K. Robinson and published by Neil Porter Books at Holiday House. Thank them for the opportunity to read this aloud to you today. Let's begin. I was the only brown person in class. So when we talked about slavery, I could feel every eye staring at me behind my back. When the teacher talked about picking cotton and slave shacks and sisters being sold away separately, I wanted to slide out of my seat and onto the floor and drift out the door. My mom had told me before that her great-great-grandmother on her mother's side was born enslaved, but she died young, so we didn't know much about her. And so I should be grateful to go to school and learn. I was. I loved to learn. But I was the only brown person in class when we talked about the struggle for civil rights in America and Martin Luther King Jr. and marches and police dogs and water cannons. On the playground, some girls giggled and whispered and giggled some more and pointed at me and looked away when I looked at them. I wanted to slip off the swing and seep into the ground, not making a sound. My mom had told me before that her grandmother on her mother's side was born free, but only got to go to school for a little while, till the 3rd grade. And so I should be grateful to go to school and learn. I was. I loved to learn. I was in the 3rd grade, and I had just learned how to multiply and how to write essays and how to think for myself. But I was the only brown person walking home from school with a violin case in my hand when that boy rode by on his brand new bike and barked at me. If it wasn't for Lincoln, you'd still be our slaves. I wanted to sprint away after him and ask, is that all you see when you look at me? My mom had told me before that she grew up in the South, and everyone in her school was brown, like me. She saw whites only, everywhere. She wasn't mad. That was just how it was. She wanted to be a nurse. She couldn't go to school for that, so she moved up north. And so I should be grateful to go to school and learn. I was. I loved to learn. I loved science. I became a doctor who writes poems and loves music. But my daughter was the only brown person in her class when they talked about slavery and when they talked about civil rights. I told her that I was the only brown person in my class, too. And just because no one ever mentions courage, strength, intelligence, or creativity, that doesn't mean it isn't there. So, she shouldn't slide to the floor or seep into the ground, but sit up straight and fly high into the sky. Because what matters more are those moments in the mirror when she asks herself, what do I see when I look at me? And when she does, I hope she will see that she is free to be anything she wants to be. The end. The end.
I feel like there are so many Black and brown children, but also adults who are like, yes, yes, I understood all those feelings. I know exactly how the little girl in the story is feeling, what she went through, what it feels like when you are in those situations. And one of the things for me that I wonder, after reading your author's note, and just having that moment with your own daughter, did you immediately think it was going to be a book? Or were you thinking, I don't know, we're going to make a song, or we're going to draw, or look at old family photos? Like, what were you thinking when you were talking to your daughter?
Oh gosh. No, I did not immediately think. I can answer the question really easily first. And no, I did not immediately think. That wasn't my first thing. Is let's write a book. I think my first thought actually was sort of surprise and kind of a shock, to be honest. So I will tell you that when my daughter was in first grade, is kind of when this whole situation came about. When we were on spring break somewhere, I think at the beach, and having a good time, and we were having a conversation just about general things, and somewhere out of the blue, she said something to the effect that she thought it was better to be white.
Mm.
And I was like, huh, where did this come from? And so, kind of the long story short, during the beginning part of the year when we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, we celebrate Black History Month. So she had learned some things about history during that time that she hadn't learned before. She gets older, she learns more details. And she was really distressed by the fact that, if she'd been born back in the old days, she wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the things that her friends would have been able to do. And I think that injustice to her really didn't sit well. She was very unsettled by that. And so we had kind of had to go through this whole process of trying to figure out, well, was there something specific that was said at the school? Was there something that someone said to her at the school? And it was really more that she was really thinking deeply about the information that she had learned, and we had talked prior, when she was in preschool and kindergarten, just about differences between people. And, some people have blonde hair and some people have red hair and some people have brown hair like us. And, all those things were not seen as anything where one was better than the other.
Right.
And for some reason, when she got to first grade and started learning more about it, then there seemed to be this whole issue where she felt like, brown skin was not as good as the others. And so, my first thought was just trying to help my daughter with her self-esteem,
Right.
try to like repair something that was like broken there, or something that was affected. And then, it surprised me that after, all the time since I was in that same spot when I was in first grade or elementary school, that there still was an issue with the way that things were being taught. And so I started to kind of think about that for a while, and just wondered what else could be done. At the same time, I started reading more about the lack of representation in children's literature, and I was actually at that point in time sort of trying to write some stories myself, but it still took me a while to think about writing this kind of a story. I really wasn't planning on doing that, and then was inspired by another event and decided, I could give it a try and see how things work out.
Okay. And just a second follow-up question to that. I'm just curious, from from the writer's perspective, about how long of a time was this? Years? Was this a few months, that you went from that situation with your daughter and having those conversations with your daughter to actually sitting down to the page and thinking about A History of Me?
Yeah, it actually took a while because, I think my process is long anyway because I'm not doing this all the time and I have that other kind of job that I do. But also sometimes it just takes me a while to kind of think about issues and kind of how I want to approach it. So when I originally got this idea for the story, I was at a conference, and listening to a keynote address by one of the authors who was there. And sort of this sort of spark, came into my mind like, oh, you should write a story about how, you have, as myself personally, have become a doctor, and like some of your ancestors were probably enslaved. At that time, I was still doing a lot of research trying to figure that out. And that seemed like a really interesting story. But I was working on other manuscripts at the time, so I didn't really think much about it. I kind of wrote a note down and sort of put it in a notebook and put it away.
I know
And
that
then a couple of years later, I do that too. And then a couple of years later, so it was like 2 years later when I kind of pulled out that notebook and I was like, this is an interesting story. And then I kind of thought about my daughter's experience and my experience with her and my own experiences when I was a kid, and thought, well, I can try to formulate this into a story to try to address that issue of, how things are being taught and whether or not the history that we're being taught, how that affects us when we are actually in school. I think also there were some other things in the news at the time about, I want to say this, reenactments of different things that happened in the past that were really affecting Black students. And
Yes.
people didn't really seem to understand why it was a problem to reenact slavery or,
Right.
just different kinds of things that were being done. And so I thought, well, maybe we should think about how to incorporate that into a story.
Okay.
So it took 2 years. And then it took me about 2 years. So that was your original question, so I forgot. So it took me about 2 years to go from that first thought and spark of an idea about the story to start writing on it. And then it took me another 2 years till I was done with it.
Okay.
So, and then another 4 years for the illustrations to be, for it
I
to be.
know how that goes too.
You're not in charge of that. You never know. So yeah, so it's been I think a 9-year process is where I calculated it.
Okay.
In all in all.
Yeah, some of them are fast, some of them are very slow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a friend who published it, who wrote a story, published it, or got it purchased after me, and her book came out before mine. And it was just like, that's just how it works sometimes. So it was kind of funny.
No, it's true. It is true. I always wonder. I know for me with Daddy Speaks Love, it was one of the quick ones,
Mhm.
whereas some of my other projects um, are still waiting to come out in the world, but they were sold a long time ago. So yeah, you never know. You
Yeah,
never know.
I think yours is so timely, right? Because of the current events that are happening in the world, that it was probably put to the top of the list in terms of for it to come out.
I mean, in so many ways it was, and I think one of the things with um inspiration and when it hits you or when you're kind of, I don't want to say forced, because in this situation I wasn't forced. It was something that I was talking to the illustrator who is a very good friend of mine, and we were on the phone, and he had said to me, his name is Evie Lewis, and he had said to me, "Did you hear the words that Gianna Floyd just said about her father to President Biden?" And I had kind of just gotten away from the TV for a little bit, and for obvious reasons, during the 2020 summer, and
Yeah.
so he was like, she said, "My daddy changed the world," and so I just started thinking about, kind of, first of all, it was this air left you when you just think about the weight of what that is that this 6-year-old is saying, and then once we kind of talked about that, we moved into this place of me thinking about my own father, who I am very, very close to. And
Mhm.
Evie knows that I'm really close to my own dad. And so I started talking about all this stuff about my dad. And he was saying how he really wanted to do some art inspired by her words. And he was going to have a poet write a poem for him and all of this. And I'm like, yes, you totally should. But at the same time, I was thinking to myself, and I said to him, I would probably step a little. No, I didn't think that at all, actually. I was thinking I'm not sure that I could do it because it's so personal a story,
Mhm.
right? And I was like, that story of hers and those words of hers are so precious, and there's so much attached to them that I'm not sure I could ever, tackle something like that. But I'm sure some of the people that we were mentioning that could do the poems. I was like, they will nail it. They will do a gorgeous job. And I'm like talking all this stuff. And so then I happen to say, but remind them to also think about. And so he goes, Leah, stop talking,
Mm.
go sit down and write. And I'm like, I'm not a poet. I'm like,
Isn't that the funny part though? It's like people tell me that all the time. It's like, oh, your words are like poetry. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not a poet. I like poetic words and I like the language and I like, playing around with stuff like that. But I am not like one of those poets. They're just
yeah,
someone else.
no,
Someone to play.
I'm not going to claim that. I'm not going to try to step into the shoes of the people that you're mentioning that you're thinking about asking to write these poems. No, but the thing for me, and for him, and he knows my dad and he knows my relationship with my dad. He was like, I know you understand what it is, so I know you'll figure it out. And so I sat with the thought for, a couple of days. And it wasn't until I thought about my own dad and I was like, how does my dad speak love to me?
Mhm.
That I started writing. So the process was super fast.
Yeah.
Because it was straight heart. You know what I mean? It was like, this is my dad is the roadmap of this book. So every spread is my dad and the roadmap of our life, and other men that fill that space in a child's life. And so that book was like kind of like yours in the sense of it was very personal in
Mhm.
a way, but it's also very universal in what we're speaking of. And so I wonder for you, when you think of History of Me and you say you're not a poet, but you use different, like this rhythm that you have in there's a certain cadence to it. There's also this coming back on um these constant refrains, and looking at that. And I'm curious, when you first started writing this, were those some of your first lines or did they come to you later? That framing of the story.
Gosh, I don't remember. It was long ago.
I'm gonna look in the book.
I think it's interesting. I don't remember the exact way that things started in the beginning. Actually, because it took me a while to try to figure out how to write the story because originally it was a third person story. It was like me trying to tell the story from afar and saying, oh, this child is going through this and this child is going through that, and then this happens and this happens. And as I read it over to myself, I didn't actually finish the whole thing. I just started with third person. It didn't feel right.
Right.
So, and I think when I've thought about it before, it's like in part because I'm used to writing in first person because I do a lot of journaling in my own personal life. And so first person sort of comes naturally when I'm writing that way. But also I think because of the personal nature of the story too, there was something that I wanted to communicate by having it be a first person
Absolutely.
because of how she's feeling. And it's like, I am feeling this way. And I felt like I wanted to seep into the ground and I felt like I wanted to disappear in lots of different ways during the story, or just like be out of the classroom. I wanted to float out the door. And so I think that was part of sort of the initial part of writing the story was trying to figure out which perspective to use. And then I don't know, I think it's sort of interesting because I think there's a great part of my own writing that's intuitive somehow that I can't really explain to people how I did this,
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
it's like when I started to write it, I was writing about, the history of things that I had learned in school. So the history of slavery, or thinking about the history of slavery and the things that I wanted to include in that. And then sort of my thought process just jumped to the fact that, oh, well, I probably had an ancestor who was enslaved. And
Right.
so I added that and then went to the history of segregation. And then, oh, well, this person went through a segregated school or didn't get to go to school at all. And so it was sort of an intuitive process of going from the past to the sort of present in terms of the child's family and sort of switching back and forth. And I really can't explain the process of that, but it's just sort of how it intuitively came to me as I was writing.
No, I mean, I get that. I think a lot of us, when we sit down and to do anything creatively, especially when it's heart work, it comes in the way that it's supposed to. Half the time you don't know, you're like, oh wait, did I do that? Oh, that'll work. And you're
Yeah.
like, let me keep keep doing that or try to keep doing that or let me channel whatever that was that got me there. But I think that happens a lot. I think it happens a lot, especially when you are bringing your own personal truth and your own personal like experience and all the things that are woven in there. It comes out the way it needs to come out when it needs to come out that way. And like sometimes you have to weave and do all these things to get there. But when you get there, you're like, okay, this will build on this. This can build on this. And I love the way that it builds because it not only is about this one little girl, it then becomes the generations before her that are not just in our ways we know would be proud of her, are have done or experienced something that she now can say, I'm going to take the mantle for us. So it was working in all of these different levels. And I thought you did a really beautiful job of kind of illustrating that through the generations and through the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that I noticed sort of after I had written it all, which the sort of intuitive part, for me it was really neat, was that I've heard, other people sort of talk about in sort of a backlash kind of a way how now kids need to have all these safe spaces in school because, they get, bullied or they get talked about or whatever. And it occurred to me that when I was writing the story, it's like I was trying to figure out like where is that little girl safe when she's out of her house, right? So when she's in the classroom, she's by herself and she's sort of feeling the weight of the history and people's eyes looking at her all the time. Okay, so then she's like, okay, well, I'm in the classroom. I don't really have a safe space here at this point in time. It's not the math class, it's just the history class. So then she goes out to the playground and then something else happens on the playground, and so there's not really an entirely safe space there for her. And then she's leaving the school when she's walking home. So in like the surrounding neighborhood, there's this sort of confrontation that happens. And I think we don't always know like all the different places where we go. There are times when we don't feel safe, that things happen. And I think that for her, and sometimes for me, personally, when I was a kid, it's like the place that was the safest was home.
Yeah.
Because that's where, everyone there were some things that were just so understood when you were at home, and of course your family is there. But the other experiences you don't always have an opportunity to talk about to people when they do happen. But thinking about like the sort of concentric circles of where kids are in this particular case, where this girl was and where she wasn't really safe until she actually got home. So.
Yeah. No, I think, for me, when I think about who we're writing for, and what we want them to kind of glean from what we're sharing on the page and what is going unsaid. I think that point of where is she safe? Where does she find safety? It also is an interesting question of, for some of us, we have to find that within ourselves, because we are constantly in, like you're saying, these different spaces that in a lot of ways are supposed to be safe,
Exactly.
but aren't always safe. And I think sometimes people will ask me, well, when I started reading Daddy Speaks Love, I thought it was a certain kind of book, but then you turn a little bit and you start talking about other things. And I'm like, well, one of the reasons is because for certain kids, that is an armor that they need to know. And that is them walking in the world, creating the safety for themselves, or is the safety that they possibly can. You know what I mean? And so I feel like you do that beautifully as the book goes on, and she understands who she can be and who she wants to be, and why she should own that and not slip down in her chair. And so I wonder, for you, when you were writing, were you at all thinking about what the illustrations might look like?
I did a little bit. I did have a few ideas, and I love the illustrations and how they are now. Someone asked me that question before. Did what were you thinking? And I think the only other thing that or the sort of the part that I felt I would have illustrated differently if I could illustrate, because I can't illustrate at all. So, yeah. But the one thing that I had thought about was just at the times when she's saying, let me just turn to one page here. My mom had told me before, so she has that refrain. My mom had told me before, that I was thinking, because for myself, the mother-daughter relationship was so central to the story that there would be an illustration that might show the mom and daughter together having a conversation.
Ah,
So
gotcha.
you get more of a sense of her being with her family or having a safe place sort of earlier in the story than toward the end. I mean, at the end, you see sort of the mom and daughter embracing. That's the little girl grown up and her daughter embracing. But in the beginning, you don't really see that. So you see more of the first child, sort of her isolation. But I had thought, well, maybe she'll be, sitting, getting her hair done, and they'll be having this conversation when she says, the mom told me. Or she'll be sitting at the dining room table doing her homework, and the mom is cooking, and they're having a conversation. So
Right,
kind
right,
of things that you would expect to see that might be illustrated. But
right.
so those are the only little things that I kind of had thought about in terms of the other things that might have been added.
No, I get that. I think for those in the audience who aren't aware, when
Yeah,
you write, you kind of give your words off. And a lot of the times you don't have any say uh,
right.
or
Can
input.
you cross your fingers?
Yes, exactly. You are crossing fingers, toes, all the things, hoping that someone understands your words and is going to turn them into this beautiful thing that you couldn't have even imagined.
Right.
That's the hope and the wish. And she really did a gorgeous job. And while I completely hear what you were saying, and I could see that spread in my
Mhm.
mind, one of the nice things about the way that she did it is it builds on the generations.
Right.
And so then you get to that present moment where kids can recognize, hopefully, whether it's a parent, caregiver, whoever that person is in their life that gives them, that knowledge, that truth, that honesty. They get to see it at the end of this book when she's building up her armor. And so I think it's beautiful. I think it came out beautiful. But I do get it. I in my brain there are so many things I envision. I'm like, what? You read that? You thought that?
Yeah. And Erin herself, when I talked with her about the illustrations, I think her focus on the ancestors was one thing where she really wanted to, show them with dignity. And,
Mhm.
where a lot of times you see people when they're working in the fields and, their clothes are tattered and other, things, they're unkempt in some way. And she's just like, well, no, let's look at this person as a human being and show them in that light as a human being. And I think that first spread where there's the cotton,
Right,
there's the cotton all around.
right.
That picture is really just so striking.
It is such dignity, but I also think it just goes to that notion of um, when you're in these classes and they're talking about slavery and the enslaved, they strip it of all dignity for us in so many ways. So an image like this, when that is what's being spoken, I think speaks volumes. Uh,
Right.
and so I think it's really powerful, and it's one of those things where for a kid you hope they're starting to question some of the other things that they see.
Hmm.
And wonder about. And I wonder when you go on school visits or you talk to kids, what are some of the questions that they ask you about this book or your personal journey or your daughters or
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I get the most is, I've done it just a few, but one of the questions I get the most is if it's a true story,
mm,
if the whole story is true. And I always say, well, it's not exactly true because then it would be a memoir or but I do like to say that, the one I do sort of focus on the fact that, yes, there were times when I was the only brown girl in class, not all the time, but there were certainly times when that did happen. But then the story in which the boy is on the bike, and he yells, if it wasn't for Lincoln, you'd still be our slaves. I mean, that is definitely a memory that I have from my childhood, when I was growing up on Long Island. And the true story is that I was walking home with my sister. So there were two of us who were walking home. And I had my violin case, and I think she had her clarinet case, and we were, walking home. Whereas normally we would take the bus, but this particular day we were just walking home. We lived that far away. And this boy just rode by on his bike and yelled at us and yelled, if it wasn't for Lincoln, you'd still be our slaves, and just kept on going. And, I was probably in fourth grade at the time, third or fourth grade. And I still remember that to this day, which is just the weirdest. It's sort of a weird thing, the things that your mind holds on to. Um,
Yeah.
but just the fact that, it was sort of like being accosted, and, you sort of sitting, you're sort of, at the time it was sort of like, I don't know this kid, he's not in my class. My sister didn't know him. He was just a kid from the neighborhood. But it was just sort of very strange. It's like, why, of all the things that you could possibly say to somebody as you're walking by, driving, riding by them, why he chose to say that. And I
Right.
think that, there was some degree of him being emboldened by whatever it was that he had been taught. Um,
Exactly.
that he felt like he could say that to us and just keep on going. And, obviously he did. But it's something that reminds me, and I tell the other kids this, it reminds me that the words that we say are really important, and they can be powerful, and we can choose to use them, for good or not. And in his particular case, he chose to use them in a not good way. But it was a reminder to me that I should be careful the things that I say to other people, even when I was a kid, to be careful of that. And so that's what I try to instill in others. It's like, choose your words carefully, choose them wisely, use them wisely, and choose kindness. I think that's something that people say now a lot. Choose kindness when you have a choice about
No,
the things that you say.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think about the need. One of the things I think about is the need for these stories, right?
Mhm.
And I was giving I was doing a webinar. I was teaching adult writers, and someone had said, but right now we need like stories that are silly and about joy and this and the other. And I'm like, yes, we absolutely need those stories, but there are other stories that are also needed. And whether that is for a particular child or all children to hear, these stories are needed and they're valid. And I wonder for you, when you think about the work that you want to create and the stories that you're thinking about doing next, kind of what's in your thought? Are you, because this one was so deeply personal, are you kind of thinking about that as your next story is going to be the same or is the same, or are you kind of a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit this, a little bit that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was, this was sort of a little different than what I had normally been writing. So I had been in a writing group, taking a writing class, had focused on other kinds of stories, more related to just sort of general childhood, not even so much, Black Boy Joy or Black Girl Magic or any of those monikers, but just really telling a good story and focusing on language and just enjoying the process. And so this was a little bit of a departure from that. I do think that for myself, um, I do tend to get inspired for things, and so it's not just sort of an offshoot of things that I write, but so I have been inspired to write certain things that are related to this, since sort of this book has sort of taken on the process of getting published. But I've also gone back to some of my earlier manuscripts, which are just regular stories, um,
Right.
for any kid and about any kid. It just happened to have sort of a Black child as the center. Because when I think about sort of the books that I sort of grew up with, there isn't really, I know a lot of people point to like The Snowy Day as the one book that they remember when they were a kid that they saw, a child who looked like them. I honestly don't have a memory of that at all. When I
Right.
was a kid, it's like there were just lots of stories, there were lots of animals, there were lots of, characters. And there wasn't a time whenever I looked that I can remember that I looked and I said, oh, that's me, or that's a child like me. It was just sort of, oh, this is their story, this is their adventure, and maybe that would happen to me, or maybe I would do something different. And so I think just getting back to just a regular kind of story with a character of interest, I think those are the things that I sort of think about, not nothing specific. But did you want to read some of your book? Because you've been talking about it and you haven't actually opened the book. Because I was thinking about asking you the question about the need, because I did feel like there was a need to tell this story because of my daughter's experience and my own experience as well. Like, I didn't remember seeing a character like this in terms of a girl who was the only brown person in her class, or a story about what it was like to hear about slavery when you're the only brown person in class, or just to hear about slavery in general as a brown person. Um, did you feel there was a need to tell your story about Daddy Speaks Love, and why?
I think for me, it was it as opposed to a need so much, it was like this moment of recognizing where we are and recognizing that a lot of kids are sitting in front of the TV watching this and they're not sure what's happening, how to process it. There are lots of adults that are watching, are not sure how to process it. And I thought about how, whether it's something that is on that intense scale or something very small, like how do we build this protective shell of understanding about the world that we are in, and how we can either help each other or help those who need help, or stand up when we need to stand up, and what does that example look like, because so many people are watching it during that summer, and
Mhm.
we're seeing people stand up and do these things. But what I was thinking about more was, how do we raise more global citizens in that way? And because this conversation with the illustrator started with, my daddy changed the world. For
Mhm.
me, it folded into how has my dad changed mine. And
Mhm.
so I'll read a couple of spreads of Daddy Speaks
Excellent.
Love.
'Cause I was looking at it and I was like, I was sort of marveling that one part that I love about the story is that there are so many different dads in the
Yes,
story.
yes,
So
yes.
many dads and daughters, or dads and sons,
That
and
was
and her.
extremely
It's
intentional.
amazing. So
That was extremely intentional. So here we go. Hopefully you can see it.
yes, I can see that.
On that very first day, bundled in blankets, you cried to be heard. Shh, baby bird, I've got you, are daddy's first words. Okay, I got it crooked.
It's good.
Daddy speaks love when he answers endless questions and makes 1,000 plans. New adventures await us, morning till night. Days full of tree climbs, the longest of hikes, of tea parties, painted nails, doing whatever we like. Daddy speaks truth, not ignoring slips, spills, or scratches. They're part of life, little one. Go ahead, make mistakes. Daddy speaks joy in tickles and giggles, squishy hugs we share. When Daddy speaks comfort, I'm so glad he's here. Shadows slip away as he tucks me in tight. Monsters will vanish as he wishes me good night. Daddy speaks learning when he says, listen up. This world isn't always fair. This world isn't always kind. And this you'll need to know. He speaks what he's seen. He speaks because he must. And so I'll stop there, but that's kind of like the turning point where I go into more of, okay, now we're going to take the lead on some of these things, and try to make a better world. And one of the things for me, that was such a treat, because I was working with a dear friend, is I got to talk about it.
Wow, my goodness.
So this was a true
Vanilla.
project of a collab. This was a true collaboration. This was every spread we talked about together, and this spread right here, I
Mhm.
can turn the book correctly, is
Yeah.
the one where, for me, when he sent it to me, I was like, oh, because it was what we talked about, but it was more than that in so many ways. And because the book was inspired by this little girl and her father, and this tragedy, it was kind of this moment to kind of think, recollect, and think about where we go from here. And so that's what Daddy Speaks Love is all about. And like I said, my dad was the roadmap for this story, because everything in it is something that my dad has done or said
Yeah. And I
or helped us realize.
and I think it's important, as you think about, what parents do, daddies do, and all the different aspects of what they do that actually are a sign of their love for you,
Yes.
and a lot of times, people don't like to do all the mushy stuff and, talk about that with dads and them being soft, but it is a sign of their love. And other things that I like about the illustrations, it's like almost all the spreads is like the child and the dad are touching in some way.
Yes.
A lot of times the dad has like a guiding hand around the child's neck or, pushing, around their side or something where you can see that they're actually guiding them. And then on the cover, it's sort of like the iconic picture for
Yeah.
dads and daughters, especially, but also dads and sons sometimes where they're being lifted up.
Mhm.
And I love that. And I think that's sort of an image that I have of George Floyd's daughter as well, although he wasn't the one that was actually
Right.
holding her at the time. And so I think that's also really sort of when you see it, it's sort of like it kind of touches your heart in that way.
Absolutely does. It
Or
it absolutely does. Yeah. I think he did, all of his work is emotion filled, but I really do feel, and I could be partial, but I really do feel like he poured his heart and soul into crafting it. And the great and wonderful thing was right when he started doing the illustrations, his son had his first grandbaby. So that first spread is his son and
Aw.
grandbaby. So I felt like it's this book that really, in a lot of ways, came full circle for both of us.
Yeah. And I think the power, I think the power, we sometimes forget the power of touch, that we have. And then certainly as a physician, we talk about that all the time. But also I think now that we've been on Zoom for for so many years and we sort of start to realize, that having that hug is really, really important. And so, in your book it shows that. And also there's that one spread in here
Mother and
where
daughter
they're hugging, and I think that's just it's yeah, I'm trying to find it here.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're hugging. And it's I think it's that connection that we have with each other, as parents of children and as parents of grandparents and so on. That is really important, that connection. And it's not just that, I can physically touch you and hold you, but I'm sort of validating your experience as well in
Right.
this in a history of me that, I was in the same kind of situation and I understand what you're going through and we can have this
It's
discussion about it.
definitely that circle of life, and it's building on, right? With each generation, it's building on something. And I just think with your book, one of the things that's just really beautiful, um, in terms of how you get to that final spread. This
Mm,
I can't
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I think it's gorgeous. And when I first read the book, right when it came out, and I was like, "Oh, man, all these beautiful Black women on the page. How could you not feel like you are meant to do something?" Like,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And I just yeah, I love it. I love it. And the words also are one of those things where any child, I think, at that point when they get to this book can have that moment of wonder, and it's like, "Do I see it in me too?" You know?
mm,
So I think it's a great way that you came full circle.
yeah.
Um,
I think the mirror too,
yeah,
because if you think about
absolutely.
it, when you're looking in the mirror, right, you're looking at yourself and you're focused on that in the moment, but then you can also see behind you.
Yes,
And even though we don't always like look in the mirror and like see people, otherwise they think we were crazy, right? But
right,
you
but
can
you always
recognize
have this feeling of, whether it's another presence, whether it's, whatever it might be. I think it's a beautiful way to close on the story and kind of bring it to this place of, again, finding that moment within yourself that you can go then out in the world, um, and do and be who you want to be,
yeah.
in all the most beautiful ways.
And I think as when I wrote this story, I think what I wanted to sort of show, um, I know in a lot of like when you're learning how to write children's stories, they tell you that the main character has to solve the problem and so on. I think there were times when I first presented the story and people said, well, the person, she ages and then it goes on to the next generation, and maybe we shouldn't have it go to the next generation. And part of the reason for
sometimes you hear the things. You're sorry, I didn't mean to
change the story. I don't. I mean, the point, at least for me, was that I had, and just sort of the personal part was that I had struggled with that whole issue of shame, and the history of the country, and how that relates to my family and all the other things that I had struggled with that for when I was in school for such a long time, and had never really talked about it with anybody. It was sort of like you went to school, you did what you had to do, to go to the next level, and you sort of sucked it up in some in some regard, because you knew that the generation before you never got the opportunity, and the generation before them never had that opportunity. And so part of it was like, you can't really complain about what you have to go through, because you have this opportunity now, so you should make the most of it. And I agree with that to some degree. But at the same time, it was sort of like, I don't want my child to have to reinvent the wheel for themselves and try to figure this out again for themselves and carry it with them throughout the rest of their childhood, their rest of their educational process, thinking that they have to prove themselves, that they're not as good as anybody else, that they're inferior. It's like, no, let's just, nip that in the bud right now. So you don't have to, try to carry this and try to prove yourself to other people, because of the history that has been taught, because it's an incomplete history that's been taught. They haven't talked about the intelligence of the people who were enslaved. They haven't talked about their creativity or their courage or the strength of those people, their resilience to make it through all of that we went through, and to get to the point where we are today. And so for me, it was like I needed to pass that baton to say, you don't have to worry about this, that this is not something that you have to try to prove. You are free of all of that to just be who you want to be and to become who you're supposed to become. And I think if we can learn to be proud of where we come from, that's beneficial for all of us.
Absolutely. And so I'm curious. I know we're gonna open it up for questions. One thing I'm curious about is, what has your daughter said?
She loves it, actually. She's funny. I mean, she's not in picture book stage anymore, obviously, but she's about to graduate high school soon.
We are always in picture book stage.
I know.
I'm just kidding. I understand what you mean.
She doesn't read them all the time, hardly ever, actually, because of high school. But she looked at it and looked through it and was just like, I forgot how much I love picture books, because we have read like 1,000. I don't know how many, but so many, and I think now she even understands the whole issue of racial justice, social justice, even more, because of all the things that we have just been through. And I think a lot of things now are coming to fruition, where people are talking about the contribution of people who are enslaved to our country, and trying to understand whether or not reparations are a thing, or it should be a thing. And the different universities that have looked at the lineage of people who were enslaved, who helped build their universities, and other things like that have started to come out. And I think it just sort of shows how much we did not know or were not taught about the history, and how important it really is, and how, again, we should be proud of the heritage that we have.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know if we will see the questions, comments.
I don't know.
Or if anyone has a question or comment that they would like to share or ask, we are happy to take those. And I think I'm just trying to think while people are thinking about their questions. I'm curious, what are you? I am not superstitious, but I keep things close. In terms of themes or whatever you want to share, what are you thinking about working on next, or is there anything that has inspired you to start kind of brain?
Well, I mean, when you talked about the whole issue with George Floyd and the issue of police brutality, I think one of the things that I was actually inspired to write a story during that time, I guess it was last year, maybe last year, last year or the year before last, related to that. Because to me, I had noticed um, a lot of the people um, that we have sort of highlighted as victims of police brutality, that they happen to have darker skin. If you look at the sort of the wide range of people, not everybody, obviously, but a greater majority of them. And so I wanted to write something about skin color, and so I wrote a story related to that. And so we'll see where it goes.
Right.
Anyway,
Now, is this another picture book? Is it longer?
it's a picture book.
It's a picture book. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But my next book that's coming out hopefully next year sometime,
Okay.
which hasn't been announced yet, so it's still in the works in terms of the illustrations and everything, is a picture book.
Okay.
And it is a story about mothers and children, and also includes animals. So that's all I'm gonna say right now.
Yay!
I love animals. I can't wait. I can't wait to see how it goes. So.
Yeah. Today actually I got the final pass of my next picture book, which is animals. And it's it's like one of those things you're looking and you just get so excited, or you start crying, or I mean, some people it's not always wonderful because their vision is not what's executed on the page, but I've been so fortunate. I have 5 picture books out, and every one of them somebody brought something to them that I hadn't thought of. And so this one that comes out next year that also hasn't been announced yet. I'm like, "Oh my goodness, oh my goodness."
We both have animals, so we're gonna
I'm
have to
so
do. Okay.
excited. Yeah. So there is a question, and the question is, and it goes to this kind of talking about the illustrations. How important are they? How exciting is it to see everything come together?
Yeah, they're really important. I mean, the way that it's supposed to work is that they're supposed to bring their vision for the story, for your words, together with what you have with the words, and sort of sometimes they can tell a different story than what you imagine or than what you envision for yourself. But yeah, it's really really important, and it is really exciting to see it all come together when it finally does. I think
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine for myself not being an illustrator, sort of the whole process and how things are gonna to come in the end. Uh,
Yeah. I think one of the things about picture books that are just so special, and also any of the books that you have on a shelf in a bookstore, that illustration on the cover is vital, right? It can be the reason why somebody actually picks it up to turn it over to look at the flap copy to find out what the book is about. And so with a picture book, it's not just I have a number of illustrator friends who always give me these gems of wisdom that I never really thought about. And one friend happened to say, it's not just about making a pretty picture. It's about bringing the story to that next page. Like, we don't want you to hover too long, right? We want you to take in the words, take in the images that help inform the words, help inform the story, and then we want you to turn the page to see the next thing. So there's this balance between, because sometimes you're like, they could have made that prettier, but then when my friend said that to me, I was like, you know what, that does make sense,
mhm.
because then you can lose what the words are even talking about if you're so fixated on what's happening on the page sometimes, right? So there is this delicate dance and this balance between the two that needs to happen. And in terms of being excited, I think there is nothing more exciting than when they get it right and you get to see words that you put out there that you're not sure anyone else is going to get, that they got them and they did something with them and they turned them into something, that you couldn't have imagined, that you might not have the skill level to do yourself.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so you're just like, wow, wow, wow. I know for me, two of my favorite ones. So I have this book called The Magic in Changing Your Stars. And every time I look at this cover, it's a book about getting up on the stage and Broadway and dance and all this kind of stuff. And every time I look at this cover, I'm like, I just want to dance. I just wanna dance. When I look at Daddy Speaks Love, I feel like somebody gave me a warm hug, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when they nail the illustrations, there is nothing better. Think about the books in the bookstore that you're like, wait a second, I want to see what that is.
Yeah, and I think for A History of Me too, with Erin, her illustrations are really awesome. And then and for the cover for this particular, it's really stunning.
It's gorgeous.
It's gorgeous, stunning.
Critically,
And it also is like she's looking right at you. And I think that's the thing, is like you can't help but look in her eyes.
no,
Like
it
you
is
try to figure out what is your story? What do
gorgeous.
you want to say? What are you talking about? And then of course it ends with that picture of all of the
Yeah.
generations, behind her in the mirror. And it's just, yeah, as other people said, when I first saw it, I got goosebumps, and it was just like, oh my gosh, this is just
When
beautiful.
I saw it, I was like, give me me, give me me. Like, give me, I want it now. It's gorgeous. And it is one of those books that, like I said, when you walk into a bookstore, a library, wherever that might be, whatever space that is, you take notice of this beautiful Black girl who is staring straight at you. And I don't want to be like, whatever. Like, this is me. What? Like, I love it. I love everything about it. And no, I think it's wonderful. And I think Erin did an amazing job. But I also have to say, she worked with beautiful words. So, so it definitely came together in a really, really wonderful way. And I'm curious, when it came to the editorial process and having conversations, before you got to the illustrations, but conversations with your editor, did you have to have a lot of conversations, or did your book come in pretty much like wrapped in its bow? I know this rarely happens for any of us, so I know I'm asking this question.
Really? Yeah, I mean, it was pretty much like that. I mean, I think we didn't really have a ton of conversations, and it was to the point where I kept asking, do you have anything you want to add? Are you gonna get back to me?
Right.
So I just sort of let it go, like, okay, whatever. They'll let me know when they want to change something, or when they want to add something. And then the next thing I knew, there were the illustrations that were coming, and and it was like, wow, this is really beautiful. And yeah, it just kind of went together. And there was sort of one thing at the end. I think when I finally saw like all of the pictures together, I think for me the picture with the mom and the daughter hugging was not there, and so I asked for sort of an additional something put in that space,
Okay.
because I wanted to make sure that there was that connection that was seen. And so then they added that picture in, and I was like, that's perfect.
And
That's exactly what I have.
it's a perfect placement. It's in a perfect
Yeah.
spot in the book. And I think it works really, really well. And I think the other thing, going back to, an editor, and whether you had a lot of back and forth and comments, it's one of the things that I think, in all honesty, is when they're heart projects, when you are writing from your heart, people recognize that, and they're like, there's not a lot I need to be touching. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? As long as it works with our page turns and all of that, and the readability, you kind of leave it there, and you say, that this works because it is from the heart. And I think this is a beautiful example of that. Absolutely beautiful example of that.
I had one little boy tell me that he thought the book was too long.
You know what? Honestly, I only have like 40 seconds left, but literally, that's how long some people want a book to be nowadays. I'm like, you want one word, you want 2 words, and that's it. Nah, the history of me is more than one word. It's longer than 2 words. It's perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, and Daddy Speaks Love. I'm really happy to have that in my library. And certainly, Father's Day is coming up. Next month there's a lot of focus on fathers, and certainly we're up almost at the 2-year anniversary for George Floyd as well.
Yeah.
And it's really something just to think about. How we how we think about the men in our lives. That they're not just fly by night people, but they actually have roles and they have
Absolutely.
meaning and importance in lots of people's lives.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
really excited about that. Thank you for reading it. for,
Hi. I'm
Hey,
still laughing at the little boys. The book was too.
I was like, you mean the time frame of the book is too long? It's 500 words. They were like 500 words.
I'm telling you, they want like
It
2
sounds so much
words.
to them.
Seems like a lot. 500 words. 500.
Thank you guys so much for joining. Leah, thank you for reading. And I also agree with you that we are always at a picture book age.
We are. Yes, we are.
Absolutely. Well, that was wonderful. I truly enjoyed it. Such beautiful stuff that you shared with us. Adria, thank you so much for writing this book. And Leah, thank you for writing Daddy Speaks Love. I think we should definitely try to get you in here for your own event, especially with Father's Day coming up. So you guys enjoy the rest of your day
Thank
and hopefully see you
you.
soon.
Yes. Take care, ladies. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Once again, if you're tuning in later, thank you for tuning in. We have some other virtual read alouds coming up, and you can get a history of me and the books in those virtual read alouds at bookshop.org and find our read along list. All right, enjoy the rest of your day.